Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we are doing a part two for the fine tuning argument. The part one, if you haven't watched, please go through it. The part two is going to go into a deeper dive into some more nuances related to the fine tuning argument. Maybe we'll try to unpack that a little bit more, deal with some objections a bit more, and see if we left out a few things, maybe we'll try to address it here. And today again we have our young philosopher Miles K. Donahue with us, and he's going to be addressing some objections related to the fine-tuning argument and some things that explain the fine-tuning argument maybe in more depth. So starting with one question that I have, which I think in our discussion we did not get the time to address, but I think it was very interesting, which you had on your channel, a discussion with Rabbi Feder and Zimmer, their page Physics to God. They came up with a very brilliant point regarding the fine-tuning argument, which I want you to expand on, which I think it might be common, but I wasn't much aware, which is that the fine-tuning of the universe is not a question, it's an answer to something that we always thought, why do some of these numerical values end up in this specific number. So can you just expand on that, what they were trying to say, that the fine tuning is not a question but an answer?
Well, that was actually one point that I questioned them on, because it wasn't clear to me what they meant. But I think what they're just saying is that the original historical reason that we care about fine-tuning is that we originally just wanted to know why these various constants of physics have the values that they do. So the constants of physics determine things like the masses of fundamental particles and strengths of fundamental forces. So the mass of the electron, the various quark masses, the strength of gravity, and so on and so forth. And these are all determined by just constants, numbers that are put into the relevant equations by hand. We just discover what they are. We don't derive them from any deeper theory. Now, the question then was naturally facing physicists, why? Why do the constants have these very specific values? Why not other ones? Is there some deeper reason? Well, what physicists discovered was that for many of these constants, they all have the values they do in some sense because they allow for life. So that's the sense in which fine-tuning is the answer to the question. That only those values, or a very, very narrow range around the values that the constants actually have, allow for the evolution of life within the universe. So that it looks like, in answer to the question, why do the constants have the values they do? Well, it looks like there's an answer to that, given that they all seem to follow this pattern of falling into very narrow ranges of life-permitting values. They have the constants they do because only those values allow for life. Now, that kind of, to me, it's somewhat disingenuous to then say that that's the right reconstruction of the relevant inquiry, because now what we just want to know is, why are the constants fine-tuned for life? And that then just brings us right back to square one of the current conversation about fine-tuning. But I think it's important to acknowledge that that second question, why are the constants fine-tuned for life, follows after the original question of why do the constants have the values they do. It's just now we have a much, we can attach a heightened significance to that quest, because the values that they do have are not just some arbitrary numbers that we'd like to know if there's a deeper explanation. Rather, they're not arbitrary at all. They all are pretty much the only ones that allow for life to evolve in the universe. And so now the question is far more significant than just an intellectual curiosity. It seems to point to something very deep about the nature of the universe and our place within it.
Right. Yeah. So it makes the question of fine-tuning even more serious. Yeah. Right.
So it's not just like, why does the electron have this very small mass and not something else? Now we realize, well, if it had a different mass, it wouldn't have been possible for life to exist anywhere in the universe. So why does it follow into this narrow range? Suddenly it's far more imperative that we find an answer.
Right. Yeah, that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
So in our discussion, we spoke about, I think, 4 to 5 things which indicate some sort of fine tuning. The gravitational constants, the cosmological constants you spoke about, the neutron mass ratio, I think that is what you spoke about. And there was one more, I can't recall right now. But what do you think about the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force?
I think those are commonly cited as instances of fine tuning, and I think it's fairly standard. It's widely accepted.
Okay. One more thing I think we can cover, maybe in our previous discussion we did not have the opportunity to cover. So in our previous discussion, if people can recall, we spoke about 4 possibilities to explain the fine-tuning argument. One was chance or brute fact, the second was physical necessity, the third was multiverse, and the fourth was design. Now we in our discussion we explained how these 3 possibilities don't work about. So then the fourth possibility, design, makes a lot of sense. Now when it comes to the 3 possibilities, I think we gave very robust responses for all 3. But I think when it comes to the multiverse, I think we could have addressed a bit more, possibly, which is also an area of your expertise. So I just wanted to know the infinite gambler's fallacy, which I think later on I saw that you address the multiverse also in this way. So can we address the multiverse objection in this way also, with that fallacy, which is also a stronger objection?
Yes. So many philosophers will claim that proposing a multiverse to explain fine-tuning commits the inverse gambler's fallacy. So it's important to set some context here. The multiverse explanation for fine-tuning has 2 steps. The first is that we postulate a probably infinite range of randomly varying universes which randomly vary in their fundamental physical features. And so if you have a large enough collection, and certainly if it's infinite with all of this random variation, you're going to get a universe that happens to strike the right balance of life-permitting constants so as to be life-permitting, just by chance. In a huge enough ensemble, you'll get at least one fine-tuned universe fine-tuned for life. The second step of the multiverse explanation is then to then point to the self-selection effect at play, the fact that observers like ourselves, life, could only exist and make observations within one of those fine-tuned universes. So of course, in this huge ensemble, we exist within that fine-tuned universe. So that's the explanation that the multiverse offers for fine-tuning. Now, the proponents of the inverse gambler's fallacy will argue that while a multiverse can increase the probability that some universe or other is fine-tuned for life, it can't increase the probability that our specific universe is fine-tuned for life. And it's that far more specific fact that needs to be explained. We can't ignore the more specific fact for the more general fact that some universe or others fine-tuned. Rather, we have to explain why this specific universe is fine-tuned for life, and a multiverse does nothing to increase the probability of this universe being fine-tuned for life. So if we think of someone's flipping a coin, we might say, what is the probability that this person flips the coin and gets 10 heads in a row? Well, it'd be very, very small. 1 over 2 to the 10, I think. Something like that. It's very small to get 10 heads in a row by chance. Well, then we might say, well, what if there are 1 trillion different people flipping coins 10 times? What's the probability of someone or other getting 10 heads in a row? Pretty almost certain. Out of 1 trillion people, I believe. That might actually be too small. If it is, then just increase the number of people such that someone or other is likely to get 10 heads in a row. Okay, we can grant that. But then return to the original question of you and your flipping of coins. What is the probability that you specifically within that group will get 10 heads in a row? Well, that remains unchanged. The probability of your getting 10 heads in a row doesn't change because other people in causally independent situations are flipping coins. It does nothing to impact the probability of your getting 10 heads in a row. So I think you can see where I'm going here. In the multiverse explanation, all it does, the only thing that changes by postulating this huge ensemble of randomly varying universes is increasing the probability that some universe or other will be fine-tuned for life. But it does nothing at all to increase the probability that our universe specifically, through its setting of physical features and constant values, would result in a finely tuned combination. That remains just as hideously improbable as before, because these universes are causally independent. They're like other people flipping a coin. It just has no bearing on the probability of this universe, call it alpha, of alphas being fine-tuned for life. So the universe gambler's fallacy is the fallacy of the gambler saying that their multiple super improbable winning hands are more likely because there are other games of poker going on out there. That just wouldn't do anything to change the probability of that specific person getting those winning hands. And I think this objection might succeed, because if it does work, it means the multiverse can't even get off the ground as an explanation for the fine-tuning of nature's constants, because the multiverse would be exchanging a more specific fact for a more general fact, which is a fallacy. So, for instance, let's say that you learn that someone or other in your friend group has a headache. And let's say there are 5 people in your friend group. Does that fact increase the probability that Donald, someone in your friend group, is the one with the headache? Well, yeah, it's some modest. If you find out that someone or other in the friend group has a headache, you'll increase your credence somewhat in the claim that Donald has that headache. It's some evidence for that claim. But suppose you learn the more specific fact that it's Mark in your friend group who has the headache. Does that more specific fact increase the probability that Donald has a headache? Well, no. And it would be a fallacy to ignore the more specific fact and focus only on the general fact, even though the general fact is true, that someone or other has a headache. Similarly, given that we know that it's not just that a universe, some universe or other is fine-tuned for life, but rather we know it's this one, we can't ignore that more specific fact when we turn to evaluate the different hypotheses in question, like chance, design, a multiverse, and so on and so forth.
Right, that was interesting. I think that was a very strong objection. I felt that, the infinite gambler's fallacy is a very strong objection against the multiverse.
I mean, many people agree with you. Many people do not. There's a hideously large body of literature that's developed around just this objection, because it actually gets into really complicated general philosophical questions that turns out it's pretty tough to resolve. But while I thought initially upon hearing this objection that it was just nonsense, I thought, oh, this has to fail. There's got to be a quick and easy response. Turns out there's not. There is not. And so while the objection might fail, it's only after going through a super long and complicated philosophical train of reasoning that we would be able to reach that conclusion. It's quite difficult to avoid the fairly intuitive core of this objection.
Interesting. That's very interesting. So I think we covered something regarding the multiverse, and now I want to move into some more objections related to the fine-tuning argument. Specifically, let's take some, some comments, I think, which are pretty interestingly got on our first video. So the starting, so I just want to know your view regarding that. The first comment that was the most interesting that I found out was one person, and people can see on the screen there, they were like, this guy's like, are you guys aware that this argument has already been shown to be flawed? ? Just like every other argument for a divine being proposed so far. So what do you have to say about this comment?
Oh, nothing profound. I mean, it's not an objection. There's no point being made here. It's just somebody who is asserting that all arguments for God fail. Okay. But that doesn't do anything to respond to anything we said in the video. I would just ask them, all right, well, then you need to get specific and tell us where the argument goes wrong. Otherwise, your assertion is just empty.
Right. And then we have another one, which I think is very interesting, I think, which we need to address. One comment says, if things weren't fine-tuned for life, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. Love to see people still argue stupid points over fallacies and misunderstandings of survivorship bias. So I think this. So I got many such comments similar to this, and just like your viewers and your commenters thought that for the fine tuning argument, who designed the designer is a very strong objection. I think this is another objection that we did not dwell into, which is I think the anthropic principle, if I'm not wrong.
Mhm.
And much of my viewers thought that this is a very strong objection against the fine tuning argument. So I want you to address this objection specifically.
Yeah.
How would you respond to this idea?
This is a good timing because I have recently read a paper examining this objection as I prepared my reply to Joe Fawley's critique of the fine-tuning argument. I did this like a few days ago, so it's all fresh in my mind.
Wow.
The thing is, while philosopher Elliot Sober has developed this objection to a certain level of sophistication, he's convinced almost no one that this is a good objection because there is a self-selection effect at play here. If the universe weren't fine-tuned for life, we wouldn't even be here to make any observations whatsoever. But that fact is just irrelevant to the evidential significance of fine-tuning vis-a-vis atheism, theism, naturalism, and so on. The most common thought experiment to bring that point out that John Leslie proposed is the marksman thought experiment. So imagine that you're being executed for some trumped up charges, some crime you may or may not have committed. And there are 20 marksmen with their rifles pointed at you. And you're blindfolded. And you hear 3, 2, 1, fire. And you hear the guns all go off, but you're still alive. You take off the blindfold and you see 20 smoking guns in front of you with the individuals holding them, looking around, but you're still alive. Now, it is certainly the case that if they hadn't missed you, you wouldn't be aware or alive to make any observations. So given that you are here, it falls automatically that they missed. Does it follow that there's no ability at all to make an inference that probably these individuals didn't miss by chance, that they did so intentionally? Well, certainly. The chances of them, all 20 skilled marksmen, missing you by chance is extremely low. Whereas the likelihood of them missing, given some plausible hypothesis about perhaps being paid off, is much, much higher. And so you obviously are warranted, given your present observations of living, in inferring that the marksman missed by design rather than by chance. Really, in exactly the same way, yes, it is the case that if the universe hadn't been fine-tuned for life, we wouldn't be here. But nevertheless, the fact that we are here to make these observations counts as strong evidence that the fine-tuning of nature's constants happened by design rather than by chance. There's more that can be said about, how you incorporate the facts about the method of observation into our analysis and so on and so forth. But I think that thought experiment makes pretty clear that just gesturing to a self-selection effect does nothing to undercut a design inference if the rest of the fine-tuning argument works.
Right. I completely agree with you. Like the weak anthropic principle is not even addressing the fine-tuning argument in some way, because the question still remains irrespective, right?
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And like I said, Sober has some more sophisticated things to say about the argument, but I think those ultimately fail as well. And if for more technical reasons. But, and I think most philosophers would agree with that, even those critical of the fine-tuning argument.
Okay, that's interesting. So I got some objections, but I don't think they were worthy, but these were like just interesting. I just wanted, instead of me presenting an objection, I wanted someone else, with their own words, objection. I got many others, but most of them I think we have kind of tackled. In our previous conversation, if people can recall, we addressed the divine psychology objection, then we addressed the God on the gaps objection, then we addressed most of the universe is inhabitable for life, but that does not challenge fine-tuning altogether. Then we also addressed design flaws that someone can point to. We addressed that. And now we also address the weak anthropic principle, and we also addressed another objection for the multiverse hypothesis. One thing I want to speak about is I think I have written a paper about fine-tuning and the problem of evil. And I think in one of your discussions, you were highlighting how, if we take all of these premises of fine-tuning, then in some cases, you cannot just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, God has some reasons for it. You cannot just evade the problem of evil, you need to have some response to the problem of evil. If I'm not wrong, I'm oversimplifying what you said. But then you also mentioned that there is one way of presenting the fine-tuning argument, but still the problem, you can still evade the problem of evil. Can you explain that possibility?
I don't know that I can summarize the possibility that I end up defending. It gets fairly complicated, but the fundamental point I make is that probably one of the leading theistic responses to the problem of evil is to defend what's been called skeptical theism. The claim that we are just not in the right so-called epistemic position to pass judgment about how likely it is God has reasons or doesn't have reasons for the evil that we perceive in the world. So many skeptical theists will compare our judgments in that regard as akin to a 1-month-old trying to judge the reasons that their parents might take them to the dentist or even bring food in from the car. They're just not going to have the conceptual apparatus to understand the reasons that motivate their parents' actions. And that's similar to finite agents trying to judge the reasons or lack thereof of an infinite God. But the problem is that the fine-tuning argument itself requires a premise to the effect that we can, to some measure, assess the reasons that might motivate God's actions. We have to show that fine-tuning has a higher likelihood given theism than given naturalism or chance. Because imagine that the likelihood were identical. It was just as improbable that God would fine-tune a universe as it is that a fine-tuned universe would arise by chance. Well, if that were the case, then our observations of a fine-tuned universe wouldn't count for theism over against naturalism. It would just do nothing to adjudicate between the two. So we have to show that the likelihood is higher given theism. Well, the only way to do that is to argue that a fine-tuned universe is the arena in which many morally valuable states of affairs can come about. Life, conscious agents are good things, and they bring about many other good things. They're valuable. And therefore, God, being perfectly good, wouldn't be all that unlikely to bring them about, and therefore wouldn't be unlikely to create a fine-tuned universe where these good things could come about. But then you're very close to the contention at the heart of the problem of evil. If we can say that certain states of affairs are good and therefore God would likely create them, then surely by the same token, we can say that some states of affairs are bad and therefore God would not likely create them. And we see many bad states of affairs in the world that is the heart of the problem of evil. And so it seems like if the fine-tuning argument wins here, so does the problem of evil, at least insofar as skeptical theism is our only response to it. And given the popularity of skeptical theism and of the fine-tuning argument, their incompatibility in this way is a serious problem, because skeptical theism comes along and says that actually we can't judge the weight of God's reasons or the actual value of states of affairs that might motivate God in structuring the world. Well, if that's the case, then we can't infer from our perceived value of conscious agents and life and so on to the weight of reasons that would motivate God in designing a universe. So you can see how skeptical theism and the fine-tuning argument conflict. And what I go on to do in the paper is explain that for most forms of skeptical theism, this claim of incompatibility is correct. There's no way to affirm both. But I do highlight one possible avenue of response that does justify the central skeptical theistic claim, but I contend does not similarly undermine the fine-tuning argument. And things get rather technical. This was actually the point at which the reviewers of the paper objected most strenuously. And so I had to develop my reflections to a certain high-level sophistication to try and combat their counterpoints. But my point was just that, in a nutshell, there's an asymmetry between the two cases. In the case of evil, we have to show that the evil we observe is actually pointless, whereas in the case of fine-tuning, we just have to show that there is a possible world that God could create where the good of conscious agents is not outweighed by the evil that they bring about. We don't have to show that the actual world is that world, just that there's a possible world. So you don't You don't have to know exactly
Uh,
what I mean here, but I argue fundamentally there's an asymmetry at the most basic level between the two arguments. The problem of evil claims that these evils are actually gratuitous, but all the fine-tuning argument needs is that there is a possible or feasible world where conscious agents in their fine-tuned universe are not more bad than good. They are good enough for God to create. And I argue we can do both of that. We can have our cake and eat it too, where we can
uh,
reject this claim on the part of the problem of evil about actual evils, but we can still affirm this claim about a possible fine-tuned universe. It gets technical. So if you're up for it, read the paper and let me know what you think.
Yeah, bro, that's brilliant because I've been always thinking about this for a long time when I saw your conversation, and I always thought that no, there has to be some asymmetry there. I always felt that uh I can't express all the technical details, but I always felt there has to be an asymmetry there. But when we are presenting the fine tuning argument, and when we are applying skeptical theism to the problem of evil, uh I think we can have our cake and eat it. And as you mentioned that, you kind of highlight how that can be a possibility. So that's brilliant. I would love to actually go and dig deeper into the paper.
Yeah,
Also, we have many other ways of from the Christian and from the Islamic religion of dealing with the problem of evil, and that's a different topic altogether. In fact, I had Joshua Rasmussen who gave a very profound explanation on the problem of evil. I would insist the viewers to watch that as well. But the point remains that, in the end, we can present the fine tuning argument, but also still adhere to, under some circumstances, still adhere to skeptical theism, which is kind of brilliant. Now, I don't want to take a lot of your time. So I think we originally decided to keep this short. So I want to know, if you have like in 2-3 points, you have like 2-3 minutes, or you don't have any more time.
sure. We can do 2 or 3 more minutes with, yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to highlight, like, some people, they don't take the fine tuning argument very seriously. Some people, maybe they haven't looked into the literature, and they haven't pondered on it, because I think this is a very powerful argument for theism, if not the most powerful. Yes, some people consider fine tuning as the most powerful argument for theism. Some people consider the contingency argument as the most powerful for theism. Some people might consider the hard problem of consciousness. But that differs. Some people might just take normal design arguments in the cell and information theory, etc., etc. So there is like one thing what's remarkable about the fine tuning argument, what I really like, is that the leading atheists who have always been the most adamant, for example, Richard Dawkins and others who have just ignored completely, said that, oh, we don't think that this argument, other arguments are a problem for their atheism. But they, surprisingly, when it comes to the fine tuning argument, they find that the fine tuning argument is actually a very powerful argument. I just wanted to highlight something very interesting. Even though now these new atheists have become a little irrelevant, but what's fascinating for me, at least, is that when I look at what they have to say. So, for example, Richard Dawkins, who does not consider any argument for God's existence to be strong, he said something quite remarkable in his debate with Francis Collin. He says that the physical constants, things like the speed of light, gravitational constant, and strong and weak force and things, most physicists agree that if you change any of these constants by even a very, very small amount, then we don't come into existence. The universe doesn't come into existence. They have to be like that in order for galaxies to form, for stars to form, for chemistry to form, actually. And then for the prerequisite for life to evolve needs that as well. I mean, if somebody was going to convince me of the need for a God, it would be there.
Mm.
Christopher Hitchens also says something very interesting. He says, at some point, certainly we've all asked, well, which is the best argument you've ever come up against from the other side? And I think every one of us picks up the fine-tuning argument. It's the most intriguing. So someone asks him the Goldilocks zone. He said, yeah. Fine-tuning, the 1 degree, well, 1 hair different to nothing. It doesn't prove design. He says it doesn't prove design, though we challenge that. It doesn't prove a designer. It could all have happened without them. You have to spend time thinking about it and working on it. It's not a trivial. We all say that. So that's kind of fascinating that uh, this makes many atheist questions. I think even Alex O'Connor says something where he finds this argument to be something that he constantly thinks about. He finds it a challenge. So this is quite remarkable, which many people, many atheists, they just try to ignore it. But many leading atheist apologists are taking this argument very seriously. So just on a final note, I want to say that, this argument should be taken seriously, even for theist and atheist when it comes to these debates. And I really like your contribution to this argument, because not many are contributing to this argument. Some people like, yes, Robin Collins and others are, but I think you are doing a fascinating job of adding on to the discussion of the fine-tuning argument, and I really appreciate, and I'm grateful that I get the opportunity to learn from you and to host you on this platform. I originally also wanted to add some quotes from the leading physicists of the world, but about the fine-tuning argument and how they are so serious regarding the fine-tuning argument. There are so many leading physicists, cosmologists, astrophysicists. All of them have some something to say about this fine-tuning. But of course, we are short for time, so I'd end the discussion here. And as a last statement, I would say I'm really thankful to have you here. You have anything to say? Maybe last two lines.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you saying that. I have found, it's funny, I picked the fine-tuning argument as my area of study, and then it quickly became my central focus, even past the master's program. Midway through my master's degree, when it was time to begin researching for a dissertation, you had to write 30,000 words. That was like half of your degree. And I just had to pick something. I had been acquainted with philosophy of religion broadly and other areas of philosophy, and at some point you just decide, there's no sign from heaven about where to move forward or how to move forward. Just pick. But holy moly, thank God I picked this one. I have found that the fine-tuning argument is so intricate and fascinating, and study of it is so rewarding, that this could be the central research project of my career as a philosopher. Because the fine-tuning argument lies at the intersection of all of philosophy and so much of science and physics at once. And so the task of properly assessing it and all of its questions and issues and sub-issues could take a lifetime to achieve. And study of its various objections and arguments and supporting lines of evidence and the dialectic back and forth pays dividends for so much else besides just the fine-tuning argument. You discover insights about science and philosophy and reasoning and life that more than justify the quest, even if you never get to an answer of does this argument succeed. But all of that goes to say, to emphasize your point, this argument is taken seriously by people who understand it. There may be a few holdouts there who know everything about the literature and still say, oh, this is obviously false. Most of them are just YouTubers. Most people on publishing on this argument, or who know the published material on it, take it very seriously. Even if they think it ultimately fails, they think it's worthy of their time and consideration. It's not a silly argument. It's not easily dismissed. It gets to the heart of very central philosophical and scientific issues. And I think it would be to one's detriment to dismiss the argument out of hand as silly. It just goes to show that someone who has that response has no profound understanding of the relevant issues. Because once you really gain an understanding of those issues, you realize that this is a serious contender for a successful theistic argument, if there was ever one.
Right. Yeah, that was profound. So I think it's my time with you here ends, but I would look forward to maybe in future, if you're working on something really interesting, I would like to host you back on this channel.
Absolutely. I have a paper under review for a contest with Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion, and it's examining fine-tuning in the gap problem, namely, how do you go from a designer of the universe to God? And so if that paper is accepted, or whenever it's ultimately published, if I send it somewhere else, I'd love to come on and discuss that.
Wow. So now we can have, like, from fine tuning can also have a second stage, you mean to say? just like contingency argument and the cosmological argument has a second stage.
Right.
The fine-tuning argument can also, so yeah, there is some objection like, if aliens have fine-tuned the universe or stuff like that. So would that paper also address that point?
Yep.
Oh, that's quite interesting. That's quite fascinating that just alone the fine-tuning argument, if it can have a second stage and that if that can lead to God, that's quite fascinating. I would love to host you. So do let me know when that paper is out. Okay. I hope to see you again. And thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on.